There are three major pieces to evolution and action. So, evolution and action is really just dealing with the mechanism of change over time. There's three major categories of change over time. All are based on obviously environmental conditions. So, environmental stresses will basically select those that are best fit for that particular environment. They live the longest, they pass their traits on to the next generation. First one is coevolution. Coevolution is when you basically have a very, very tight relationship between two or more species. And great examples of this are parasites that are designed specifically for a host. Herbivores are animals that eat strictly vegetation. So they have a very close relationship with plants and flowers and pollinators. So flowers are the reproductive organs of plants, and pollinators are basically those organisms that move the reproductive cells from plant to plant to plant. Plants can't move, but they need to reproduce. So they need some way in which to move their reproductive cells, and pollinators usually play that role for them. This is an example of a pollinator in a flower. They're specifically designed for each other. So this is the reproductive piece of the plant. A flower has the pollen on it. The actual egg of the flower is more closely more closely tied to the stem. So that's where the egg is located. So we basically need to move reproductive gametes from here to a different flower and get those reproductive cells down into the stem. So this pollinator is specifically designed for this particular flower, as we can see by the proboscis, which is kind of the nose tongue structure of the insect. If this changes, this has to change. If this changes, this has to change. So they're very, very closely related to each other. Another example, so the reproductive cells of the flower are right here. So when this particular bird with a specifically designed beak that fits in this specifically shaped flower, we get reproduction in terms of the pollination of the bird the bird moving the gametes from flower to flower to flower to flower. Okay, so the pollen will land on the forehead of the bird. The bird will go to another flower, and as a result, those reproductive cells will fertilize the egg of another flower. Convergent evolution is when organisms appear to look the same, but they're not closely related at all. And this is evident when we have similar environments in different parts of the world. So the environment always selects particular features that are the most advantageous. Australia represents a great example of convergent evolution. Australia is an island continent, so it's been isolated from the mainland for millions and millions and millions of years. So as a result, it has a very unique type of organism located there because they have changed over time in isolation. We have mammals here in North America. When we go to Australia, they have organisms that look like our mammals, but they are marsupials. Marsupials have pouches, external pouches, where the embryo will leave the internal parts of the mother, crawl out and into the pouch, and then make that connection to the mother. So we have an umbilical cord that attaches ourselves to the placenta when we're very small, whereas a marsupial does not have a placenta, but it still needs to be attached to the mother for nutrients. And it does so externally in that pouch. So think about a kangaroo and the joey sits in the pouch. That's basically its external placenta. So those are marsupials. So in Australia, they have moles, and we have moles, and they look exactly the same because they both live in the same type of environment that moles live in. But the mole in Australia is a marsupial. We have mice, they have mice. Their mice happen to be marsupials. We have lemurs, they have lemur-like creatures, but they're marsupials. We have flying squirrels, they have flying squirrels, but they're marsupials. Okay, we have bobcats, they have Tasmanian cats, look the same. One's a marsupial, one's a mammal. We have wolves, they have Tasmanian devils, and they look like wolves, but this is a marsupial and this is a mammal. Okay, convergent evolution, very, very dissimilar organisms that look exactly the same. It's another picture of the same thing. This would be a great example where we have an aquatic environment where all aquatic organisms look relatively the same because they're all living in the same environment. The water dictates and demands a certain structure, shape, in order to perform well in there because of the fact that you need hydrodynamics in order to move through the water efficiently. So if we look at a reptile, a fish, a mammal, and a bird, they all have relatively the same shape. That's an example of convergent evolution, very dissimilar organisms that look relatively the same based on the environment. If we live in the air, we have a bird, we have a bat, we have a reptile, we have a fish. All have relatively the same type of structure because of the aerodynamics that are required in order to fly properly. The same structure is required regardless of the type of organism. So even though these are very different from each other, they look relatively the same because the environment is selecting that particular trait. Divergent evolution is when we basically have a population that gets more and more dissimilar. A shark represents a great example of divergent evolution, where we have a common ancestor, but what we have today, the type of variety that lives today, is enormous. Hammerhead shark compared to a great white shark, very, very dissimilar in terms of the way they look, but how they function is, or basically their relative is relatively close to each other. Adaptive radiation is basically in the wild where you have a more and more dissimilar organism that changes over time from one ancestor. But then we have artificial radiation. Artificial radiation is the domestication of organisms by humans, and we make them more and more dissimilar based on our controlling of their mating practices. We have certain traits that we like in our domesticated organisms that we select for, and we control the mating and passing of that trait on from generation. So the dog represents a great example of artificial radiation or domestication. We basically know that a dog is supposed to look like a wolf, but obviously now we have a variety of different types of dogs. We have Chihuahuas, we have hairless dogs, we have pugs, we have Great Pyrenees, we have greyhounds, we have labs, we have pointers. Okay, all are dogs and all have a relatively common ancestor relatively recently ago, but we have caused a rapid change in the way they look by controlling their mating practices. Horses are another great example. All have a common ancestor, but we have burros and donkeys. We have the type of horse that we think of when we have a horse, and we have zebras. Okay, so they're all relatively horse-like creatures, but very dissimilar from each other. So divergent evolution. Darwin's finches were a great example of divergent evolution. You had a finch population on the Galapagos that became very, very dissimilar because they were separated from each other, and the environment caused rapid diversification in their beak structure. So even though they're all finches and they all have a relatively recent common ancestor, they're very, very different from each other.